Hello, I'm taking on a challenge to beat every playable Nintendo published game. Welcome to the next episode. The year is 1981. Nintendo had just launched Radar Scope and it was a total commercial failure. Nintendo shipped 3,000 units to the US and they were only able to sell through a third of them. This meant that there were 2,000 units sitting in Nintendo's warehouse in Washington. This was extremely costly for the newly founded Nintendo of America. In order to recover from this, Nintendo of America's president, Minoru Arakawa, asked his father-in-law and president of Nintendo, Hiroshi Yamauchi, to make a new arcade game with the intention of converting all the unused Radar Scope machines into this new game. Yamauchi agreed and decided they needed to make a game that would target Western markets in order to sell these units. Yamauchi polled the entire company's talent pool for fresh design concepts. From this search, Shigeru Miyamoto, who worked as an artist at the time, was tasked with designing the game, and Gunpei Yokoi, the head engineer who conceived the Game & Watch games, was the project supervisor. At the time, Nintendo was trying to obtain a license to make the game using the characters from Popeye. However, the deal fell through, and instead, Miyamoto decided to make new characters that would mirror the love triangle between Popeye, Olive Oil, and Bluto. Thus, the characters Jumpman, Lady, and Donkey Kong were born. Miyamoto decided on a monkey since he didn't want to make the villain too evil or repulsive. Since the game was intended to appeal to a Western audience, Yamauchi mandated that the game be given an English title. So, Miyamoto decided to name the game after the villain, Donkey Kong. There are a few different stories as to exactly how Miyamoto came up with this name, but what we do know is that Miyamoto intended for the name to convey the thought of a stupid ape. Miyamoto's design ideas for the game were ambitious. Yokoi even thought that Miyamoto's initial design concepts were too complex, and not everything made it into the final product, such as a seesaw that would launch Jumpman across the stage. One of his ambitious ideas that did make it into the final product, though, was his idea to use 4 different stages. A small team of programmers complained that this was like asking them to make the same game 4 times over. Most games at the time only featured a single screen that would evolve with more difficult objects as the game progressed. Another big difference was that instead of focusing on destroying waves of enemies or collecting items like most arcade games at the time, the goal was to get from point A to point B. The concept of using jumps to maneuver through a stage was pretty revolutionary too, and there was nothing else quite like it. Yamauchi had high hopes for the game, so they shipped it off to America for testing. There were some initial reservations about the game due to how different it was. However, Arakawa was adamant that it would be a hit, and they began translating the storyline for the arcade cabinet and flyers. It was in the US where they came up with the name Mario, named after Mario Segale, the Italian landlord who owned the warehouse that Nintendo of America was renting to hold the arcade cabinets. While we don't see this name appear on the actual machine, it was used in the flyers to describe the hero of the game. When the time came, Arakawa himself, along with a skeleton crew that included his wife, gutted the 2,000 Radar Scope machines to convert them into Donkey Kong units. When the game launched in July of 1981, it became a knockout success. The initial 2,000 cabinets were sold out quickly, and by October, they were selling 4,000 units a month. After a year, they had sold roughly 60,000 units. What a massive turnaround after the measly 1,000 units of Radar Scope that were sold. The game propelled Nintendo into stardom, and it was the birth of the most iconic figure in all of gaming. It's hard to convey just how much of an impact this game has had on all of gaming as a whole. With all that established, let's jump into the actual game. For whatever reason, the level structure of the game was slightly different in the US and Japanese versions, so I decided to play both of them. Initially, I actually considered these games to be 2 separate games in the challenge, but there's so many games with minor regional differences that I decided to count them as the same game instead. So, what's actually the difference between the two? In the Japanese version, you play through the levels 1 through 4 in order right from the get-go, making each loop a repeat of the pattern 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. In the US version, the game only starts with 2 levels, and after you finish a loop, a new level is added. This happens again until the 4th and final level is added, and for some reason, after this, level 1 keeps appearing more and more often. This makes the loop structure follow the pattern 1, 4, 1, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 1, 3, 4, 1, 2, 1, 3, 1, 4. After this, that final pattern is done on repeat. I'm not totally sure why they made this change, and personally, I much prefer the way the Japanese version does it. It gives the game better variety, and you don't have to play as long to start seeing new content. Since I generally plan on playing the US version of games, I started with the US version here. Thinking back on it, I probably would have started with the Japanese version, so I could have better familiarized myself with the levels. Many of you probably already know this, but in this game you play as a plumber named Mario, also known as Jumpman at the time, and you are trying to rescue Pauline, who was also known as this lady at the time, from the clutches of the villainous Donkey Kong, whose name hasn't changed at all. The game starts with a classic cutscene. Donkey Kong carries Pauline up a construction site, stomps around, and lets out an iconic laugh. It's clear right from the get-go just how much more personality this game has than a lot of the other arcade games released at the time. After this, you're prompted with a challenge. How high can you get? You apparently start at 25 meters. In the first stage, you start at the bottom of the screen and have to make your way up a bunch of slanted slopes and ladders. Donkey Kong throws barrels down at you, and you have to jump over them or weave around them using the ladders. There's also a hammer power-up that you can use to destroy the barrels, but I didn't use it a ton on this stage since it is far more useful for racking up points, and I was more concerned with just reaching the objective. In addition to these barrels, Donkey Kong will occasionally throw a blue barrel, which turns into a malicious fireball once it lands in the barrel of burning oil at the bottom. The fireballs can move up the ladders and can be a big threat if you let them get too close. One of the things that makes this level tough is that the barrels will randomly roll down a ladder rather than its standard pattern. This adds a layer of unpredictability, and it can make climbing up ladders really dangerous if a barrel is approaching. In these moments, you can take a risk and just hope that the barrel won't come tumbling down towards you, but I ended up meeting face to face with barrels more than once making gambles like this. It won't come down. Ah! I generally found it better to wait for a safe moment where I was fairly confident no barrels would hit me out of nowhere. Another thing that makes this level tough is that the randomness can occasionally cause some extremely tricky barrel setups that feel near impossible to jump over. There's probably ways to make it over these jumps just right, but regardless, I died a lot to these kinds of setups. I was already fairly familiar with this game, so I had a decent understanding of the mechanics. That being said, I still died on this level on my first try. I was waiting at the ladder for a safe moment when a barrel came tumbling down just as I was landing from a jump, and I wasn't able to jump back up in time. I lost again on my second attempt, making one of those gambles and dying because of it. In my third one, I died to another mechanic that often gets me in this game. You have to move quite a bit up the ladders before you can start moving again. I thought I was at the top and ready to jump over the barrel, when in reality, I needed to move up a bit more, and the barrel came tumbling through me. Finally, on my next run, I made it to the top. A heart appears between Mario and Lady, only to get shattered a moment later as Donkey Kong grabs her and takes her away. After this, the next level starts, and in the US version, this is level 4, the final level. In this level, you must remove all 8 rivets by having Mario pass over them. The biggest obstacle here are some sentient fireballs that roam around the level. They have some sort of AI, but I'm not totally sure how they actually work. Once a rivet is removed, you have to jump over the spots to pass over them. This also means that fireballs can't pass over them since they can't jump. This can help you trap them on one side, but it can also become an issue if they get stuck on a side where you have more rivets to clear. This one isn't as hard as the first stage, and I cleared it on my first try. After this, the stage tumbles and Donkey Kong falls to his doom. Mario and Lady are finally reunited, and they are not interrupted this time. So, game complete? Well, once again, we're faced with a dilemma. When should this game end? I've technically seen the ending, so does that count? The speedrun goes until the kill screen, and I definitely have no intention of going that far. It's a bit arbitrary, but I decided to go for beating the loop that includes levels 1, 2, 3, and 4. This way, I have beaten at least one loop, as well as every level at least once. This meant that this run was not over yet. After a couple more deaths on the first level, I made it to the next level, level 3. This is the one that awful 75-meter stage from Smash Bros. Comes from. This one features far more treacherous platforming than any of the other levels in the game. There's moving platforms and jumps galore. One thing that catches a lot of new players off guard is that you die if you fall too far. The moving platforms on this stage make it really easy to die this way, so you've got to be careful and time your jumps well. Other than a couple of roaming fireballs, the biggest hazard is the springs that bounce across the top and fall down the side. These are difficult to weave through as you jump from one side to the other, but the real difficulty comes in the last stretch. You have to climb up a ladder quick enough before a spring bounces up and hits you. This is not easy, and it gets especially hard as the loops progress and the game gets faster. I remember dying a lot to this as a kid. There's always a slight variance in the position of the springs too, and that can throw you off if you aren't careful. However, since I had some experience with this game beforehand, I managed to beat this one on my first try. After this, we're back to stage 4. After stupidly dying by falling off the side, I beat the level with no lives remaining. Curiously, it actually plays a different victory theme every other run through the level. I had no idea this existed until recently. With that, the loops repeated and it was back to level 1. This was the final loop. Surely I could beat all 4 levels with no lives remaining, right? Right? Unfortunately, it was not meant to be. In an effort to jump, I grabbed a ladder and died immediately to the barrel in front of me. What a dumb way to go. Guess it was back to the start for me. But hey, I did pretty well for my first run. Surely I will get this on the next try, right? Nope, it wasn't even close. I lost almost all my lives to the first level on my second loop. Honestly, out of all 4, I found the very first level to actually be the most difficult. My third attempt went better, and I made it back to the third loop, but once again, I died a bunch to level 1. In my next run, I died to those pesky springs in loop 2. Dang, how did I do so good that first run? After many attempts, I finally managed to beat the first level in loop 3, making it to the final level I hadn't seen yet, level 2. In this level, you're in some sort of pie factory. The level features massive pies on conveyor belts, and the pies will end your life if they touch you. Why on earth is the pie here so dangerous? Anyway, these conveyor belts occasionally switch the direction they're moving, which can be a bit tricky when you have to pass over them. I didn't find this level too difficult though, and I managed to make it to the top on my first try. I'm getting pretty close now, surely I don't mess this up. I lost a life to the spring level, but I was able to beat it on my next try. I made it to the final level with 2 more lives remaining. 2 lives should definitely be enough. This had to be the run. My first attempt didn't go so well though, and I got trapped between 2 fireballs and lost a life. I only had 1 life left. Oh no. In my last life, I played far too cautiously. You see, this game also actually features a timer, and if you take too long, you lose a life. I tried grabbing the hammer to extend my time in the game, but unfortunately it was not enough. When my hammer ran out, it was over. I lost with only 2 rivets left. What a bummer. However, where I failed in the last run, I made up for it in the next run. This time, I had 3 lives to the final level, and while I did lose one of them, I finally beat the third loop on my next try and saw the cutscene one last time. I kept going after this, but I died pretty quickly and then returned back to level 1. With that, the game was complete. However, if you remember what I said before, I also decided to play the Japanese version of this game. I won't spend a whole lot of time talking about it, but I did decide to beat 2 full loops to hear both of the ending songs, which ended up being a bit more difficult than I anticipated. As I said before, in this version of the game, you see all of the levels with each loop, which I far prefer to the US way of doing it. In my first run, I lost my last life to the spring level on my second loop, so I didn't get that first try victory. My second run went a bit better though, and I managed to beat level 4 in the second loop with 3 lives remaining. At this point, I was finally done with the game. On to the review. This one is a clear step above everything else I've played up until this point. The variety in the levels alone goes a long way in this, and it's nice to actually play as a character with more complex movement options. While the story itself is obviously really simple, the game is full of character, and for an arcade game, it has a lot of charm. It's pretty easy to see why this one was such a huge hit. There are a couple issues for me personally that knock it down a bit for me though. The physics do feel a bit clunky at times, although to be fair, this was essentially the first game to feature jumping mechanics like this, so it's still really impressive for the time. However, if you've watched my previous videos, my biggest issue should not come as a surprise. I'm just not that into high score chasers. I don't have a whole lot of motivation to beat my high score, so I typically get bored of games like this quicker than others might. Ultimately, my personal rating for the game is a 7 out of 10. It's a huge step up for Nintendo and gaming as a whole, but not everything here is to my personal tastes. If you like high score chasers though, this is one you don't want to miss out on. Before ending the video, I actually want to touch briefly on a topic I talked a bit about in my first video on Color TV Game 6. If you saw that one, you may recall that I said I generally don't believe that games age poorly. What I'm about to say may seem contradictory to that statement. If I was a big arcade goer in 1981, I might have called Donkey Kong a 10 out of 10. So, what gives? Because I gave the game a 7 out of 10 now, does that mean I think the game got worse over time? Not really. If you remember, my ratings for the games in this challenge are not intended to be taken as objective reviews. Generally, my ratings are based on how much I personally enjoyed the game, and games I enjoy on a similar level get bumped together. Games I enjoy the most will go into the 10 out of 10 category, with everything else portioned off into separate chunks of similar enjoyability behind it. Note, this doesn't mean I evenly distribute every game I play. Rather, I evenly distribute every level of enjoyability a game might possibly have. So, how does this explain the difference between a 10 out of 10 I would have given in the past and a 7 out of 10 I would give now? Basically, since my scores will always inevitably exist in relationship to one another, the score of Donkey Kong went from a 10 out of 10 to a 7 out of 10 because the maximum enjoyability I have found in gaming has gone up. So really, the game didn't get any worse. I still enjoy the game now as much as I would have back then. Rather, games eventually came out that, to me, were more enjoyable. Now, for those of you that fondly remember the old days and are disappointed in what gaming has become, don't worry, we'll hit that 10 out of 10 peak before long. Some of my favorite games are from the late NES days into the SNES days, with games like Super Mario Bros. 3, Super Metroid, The Legend of Zelda: Link to the Past, and Donkey Kong Country being some of my all-time favorites. Lastly, I know there are some of you out there that still might consider this to be one of the most enjoyable games ever made, and that's okay. That's where personal enjoyability comes into play, and I can largely point to my general dislike of high score chasers to explain such a huge difference. Now I know some of you might also be rolling your eyes, thinking these games have obviously aged poorly, and I shouldn't spend so much trying to appease everybody. However, I share all this not really to sway anyone into agreeing with me on my scores, but to hopefully help people better understand why I rate these games the way I do. I still think Donkey Kong is a really fun game, and for the time, it was nothing short of revolutionary. Thanks for watching the video. If you want to see more of these in the future, make sure you subscribe to the channel so that you won't miss out on the next one. Also leave a like if you enjoyed it, since it'll help the channel grow and motivate me to continue this series. I hope I will see you in the next step of my quest to beat every Nintendo game.